week. Got to take advantage. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're on page Reish Mem Beis, and we're starting Sif Yud Beis today. What we were learning up until now is the we'll learn a couple of cases in the Likutim before we start Yud Beis today. Just to finish up, as far as paying your dues on time to the worker or to the service provider. Schiras karka, ein Imrei Yaakov. So we said we refer you to the Imrei Yaakov, where we talked about payment is due on rent as well. You have to pay it on time. He says, "V'habal litvol b'mikvah prati, v'habalan tovea tashlum." A person goes to a private mikvah, and the attendant says, "This is what you have to pay." Or there's a sign that says payment is due. Yesh bo mishum bal talin. There's a prohibition of bal talin if you don't pay. Now, this is an interesting halacha, right? We have people that come to our mikvah who are not members, and especially the Kalim mikvah. People say, well, I just have to toivel a spatula, okay? But there's a fee. We charge $5 for non-members to use the Kalim mikvah. Well, I just have a spatula, so I'm just going to go in and I'm going to use it. They ignore the sign. So they've done a wonderful mitzvah in Choshen Mishpat, but at the same time have violated Choshen Mishpat. They've done a wonderful Yoredeya halacha of Tvilas Kalim, but they violated a Choshen Mishpat halacha. Now, there is a sign, that there is a slot, a mail slot. I think sometimes there is, but people tend to ignore signs or pretend not to see signs. Okay. Next, echad natam l'chayat beged la'asoto avuro, hainu avur hachayat atzmo b'matana, v'hivticho she'itin lo schar malacha gam kein ein oiver bazeh al bal talin. If your friend is a tailor, and you say, I want to give you a gift, I want you to make yourself a suit, and I'll pay for it. So then if you don't pay him when the suit is finished, but you delay, then there's no bal talin. Apparently, because there's no fixed time that that the guy promised that it would be done, and so there's no bal talin. Sochar dira mechavero, v'yatsa mimenu lifnei zmano, im chayav l'shalim schar dira ayin biurim. That's what we just saw on Friday, that if you leave a rental space early, whether you have to pay the remainder of the time is something that will be discussed in the biurim. We saw that already. And that was the whole topic of discussion, where we basically saw that it's a machlokas haposkim. Okay, let's go now on to Sif Yud Beis. So now the question becomes, when the Torah says biyomot itein scharo, you have to pay him when the day is done, when the labor is done. So ve'ezehu zmano, what is that time? Like what is considered to be payment to do? Im kolsa hamalacha biyom. Yesh lo zman litein haschar ad sof hayom. If the work was finished during the daytime, then the employer has to pay by the end of the day. V'im yatsa hayom v'lo nesano lo avar al biyomot itein scharo v'lo savo alav hashemesh. And if the day elapses and I haven't paid him, so I have violated the negative commandment and the positive commandment of pay him on that day and do not allow the sun to go down on him. V'im kolsa hamalacha la'achar shiyatza hayom yesh lo zman litein haschar kol halayla. Now, if the worker finishes the work at night, in other words, he started in the morning, but it was, let's say, a 14-hour job, and he finishes and it's already nighttime, so then you have the entire nighttime in which to pay him. Ad haboker, below ad bichlal. You have until morning, but the morning is not included, so you must pay him before dawn. Hikevin shehigia haboker avar alo salin pulas sachir itecha ad boker. Because if you don't pay him before the morning arrives, then you're in violation of the negative commandment. Do not delay the wages of the worker with you until morning. Shebischir yom hakasuv medaber shehu oved kol hayom ad halayla. He says, because that pasuk is talking about a day laborer who works into the night. And payment for works rendered is only due at the end of the workmanship. And for that reason, in a situation where a guy worked into the evening, you don't become liable for work rendered, because it's only due at the end of the period of workmanship, and he hasn't finished the job yet. So therefore, if he continues working into the night, you're not in violation of he says, give him his wages in his time and do not allow the sun to pass, is referring to a person who works at night, who works until morning. And that also is a way of reading the pasuk. And therefore, you're not, if you don't pay him, you're not, if the guy works through the night, then you're not in violation of the other isser of do not delay until morning. In other words, there's multiple isurim. When you're in violation of one, you're not in violation of the other, and vice versa. Uvizman hazeh sheschire yom shalanu enam obdim ad halayla tzarech litein lahem scharim kodol halayla shelo la'avor al velo savo alav hashemesh. He says nowadays that our workers tend to work only during the daytime. He's talking in the 18th century, so things have changed because of electricity. But before electricity, people would only work during daylight hours. So then, since they only work during daylight hours, they finish while it's still daytime. You have to give them their wages before nightfall so that you do not let the sun go down on him. He says, and if they continue working into the night, you're not going to be liable unless you let the morning rise. Shekaven shekolsa malachtam balayla yesh lezman leporim kol halayla, because since they finished into the night, you have the whole night in which to pay them. I don't know why he's repeating it. It seems like it's a bit repetitive, huh? Now, v'im hu sachir l'sha'a o pachos o yoser. So now, if he's working by the hour, right? If he's an hourly laborer, or even a little bit less or a little bit more, imhi biyom yesh lo zman leparo ad sof hayom, sha'az oiver mishum velo savo alav hashemesh. So even if he's worked for you from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., you still have that entire day to pay him wages. V'imhi balayla yesh lo zman kol halayla ad haboker velo ad bichlal. And if he worked for you at night, you have the entire night to pay him. And if he worked from the day into the night or from the night into the day, the criterion is what time did he finish? The finishing time determines whether I have the whole day to pay him or I have the whole night to pay him. V'chein sachir shavua, sachir chodesh, sachir shana, yatsa mimalachto b'yom yesh lo zman kol hayom bilbad, yatsa b'layla yesh lo zman kol halayla bilbad. And the same thing applies, even if a person is working for you longer than a day, he works for you for a week, a month, a year, whenever he's finished with his work, that's when payment is due, which is a little bit strange because what if a guy's going to work for you for a year and not get any salary at all? Technically, payment is due at the completion of the job, like a contractor. You know, after all the materials have been bought, technically, payment is not due until work is finished. Now, no contractor works that way, right? I'm not aware of any contractor that works that way, right? So we'll have to see, what exactly the mitigating circumstances are in modern day employment, but that's technically the halacha. If he finishes any time, any duration of work, you have within a 12-hour window to pay the worker at the completion of the job, whether it's daytime or whether it's nighttime. Okay, so let's go back and look at the Meforshim. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really only fair when you think about it. Yeah. Yeah, and the labor, right? A job can take over a year to complete. People have to eat. Okay. Ad sof hayom, you have until the end of the day. V'tzarech lizoher lo kodem shkias hachama. Da'azu bevad hayom. Dela'achar hashkia ukvar ben hashmashos. He says, and you have to be careful to pay him before sunset. In other words, don't run to mincha before you pay him. Yeah. So make sure, because once sunset sets in, it's now a suffix whether it's nighttime or not. Bimlo paralo kodam ashkia al kolponim yerli furlo lo kodam tzeisa kochavim di ilav hachi bevada yavar as belav v'aseh. And if you neglected to pay him before sunset, then surely make sure that you pay him before nightfall, before tzeisa kochavim, which is 42 or 45 minutes later. Ad haboker, you have until morning if he's works into the night. Ainu ad alos hashachar. That means until dawn. Over mishum baltalim. And once dawn arrives, then you're in violation of baltalim. Shebischir yama kasav medaber. He says one pasuk is talking about a day laborer, another pasuk is talking about a night laborer. He says, Perish, let me explain what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is saying. Do not leave the wages lingering until the morning. That pasuk refers to a worker who works during the day but doesn't complete his work until he gets into the nighttime. The kaven de kaimel and dischiras ena mishalemes elalabasof. And since we paskin that wages are due only at the end of the job, lachein afal pi sha'avad kol hayom mikol makam hol v'hagamar hayabalayla yesman l'shalim lo kol halayla ad haboker. But since he didn't finish until nightfall, you have the entire night to pay him. He hadn't finished his work before sunset to make you obligated to pay him. Okay. Litain lahem scharim kodem halayla. He says, so once again, you have this statement that nowadays our workers do not work into the night, so you have to make sure you give them their wages during the day. V'hu hadin erev Shabbos daholek me'avodaso kodem shkias hachama tzarech lefaro az. And similarly, even if normally a person does work into the night, but it's erev Shabbos, you have to be very careful to pay him before Shabbos comes in. You can't say I'll pay you after Shabbos. So there is actually he quotes a bir halacha here. Let's just take a quick look at the bir halacha on the screen. Siman Reish Mem Beis. Just bring it up on Safari. Um, 242. Beer halacha. This siman is talking about the obligation to show proper honor to Shabbos. And even if you only have a little bit of money, you're supposed to find something special to honor Shabbos with. And so that's really the theme of to honor the Shabbos. V'im yesh lo rak ma'at ma'os. Here, let me see if I can make this any bigger. Hold on. I don't think so. Let me see. Can I make this bigger? One second. Maybe that's better. Hold on. V'im yesh lo rak ma'at ma'os. Uba sachir litzvoa avur pu'ulas shegomer lo hayom. He says, if you only have a small amount of money left over at the end of the week, and a laborer comes on Erev Shabbos and says, you have to pay me for my completion of my work, dim gomro me'esmol en olav rak isr de bal tishech umavur b'choshen mishpat v'kishar bal choiv da alma ach b'talmud chacham yesh la'ayin, etc. He says, if he finished the job yesterday, while it was still daytime, then you're still over by not paying him. But if he mamish was doing a job that finished on Friday, there's even more of a chiyuv to pay him on that day. So nira ditzarach litnam lahapoel k'dei lakayim mashakasuv biyomoti tein scharo below sava olav hashemesh. It would seem to me that even if this is all the money that you have in order to honor Shabbos properly, you still have an obligation to prioritize that money and pay your worker first. Af sha'al yedei zeh lo yishoyer lo bameh la'aneg haShabbos. Even if through paying your worker, you won't have the proper honor that you need, you won't have the finance you need in order to go to buy dessert or whatever that special thing that you want to buy for Shabbos. Oh, sheyifayasenu sheyitratzeh lahamtin ad achar Shabbos, the chiyuv tashlumi schir bizmanu hu midioraisa v'zehavi rak midivrei Kabbalah. He says, or there's the only other way that you can do that, that you can accomplish both, is if you ask the worker, would you mind waiting until after Shabbos? And if you can convince him to wait and have him to be moichel, then that's also acceptable. And the reason, says the Mishnah Berurah, why paying the worker takes priority is because the obligation to pay a worker on time is a biblical law, and the obligation to honor Shabbos with something nice is only a derabanan. It's only something that we have from our prophets post-biblical. Va'afilu lahaposkim, zegam kein havi midioraisa chomoshe kasavnu b'Mishnah Berurah sham, b'Mishnah Berurah sham havi aseh v'lo saseh v'lo asi aseh v'dochi lo saseh v'aseh. And even if you'd like to argue, as we have mentioned the Mishnah Berurah, that there are some poskim who say that the mitzvah to honor Shabbos is a biblical law, but even if they're both biblical laws, the obligation to pay your worker on time is both a negative and a positive commandment, whereas the mitzvah to honor Shabbos is only a positive commandment. So the former trumps the latter because it's both a positive and negative, and that takes priority over something that's just a positive. Because the Torah says observe the Shabbos, protect the Shabbos, remember the Shabbos. So to honor it with extra additional food or something nice may or may not be under that rubric, and that's the dispute. Zelo mikri kitavo ve'enlo de'ena oiver beval tolen. Now, we did learn that you're not in violation of Baal Tolen if you don't have the money. So what about the argument? Maybe I can tell the guy, I'm sorry, this money was set aside for Shabbos. I don't have enough money to pay you, right? So let's say he charges, he fixed my stopped up sink, the plumber, and he finished it. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I've got only my credit card's not working. I was planning to run to Sobeys to pick up dessert for Shabbos, and I've got cash. And the guy says it's $180 or $200 or whatever it is, and I've only got that amount in cash, and now I'm not going to be able to go to Sobeys. I can't tell him, I'm sorry, I don't have the money. Now, technically, if you don't have the money to pay a laborer for whatever mishap, you're not in violation of Baal Tolen. Remember, we learned that before. You're only in violation if you have the money, but you don't pay him because you tell him to come back tomorrow. The Mishnah Berurah, so the Bir Halacha says, that's not called not having the money. You do have the money. It's just that by giving him the money, you won't be able to go to Sobeys and pick up dessert. So that's, therefore, you have to pay. That payment takes priority. Now, what if the laborer is bringing you the goods that he worked on? Let's say it's a cobbler, and he comes to your house Erev Shabbos to deliver you your shoes that he just fixed. And he says, so then obviously when he delivers the goods, payment is due. Okay, but he says you have another eitzah, which is shelo lekabel mimenu, refuse delivery. Va'az eino over afilu yimamer lo hapol bo betul achefetz mimeni. He says even if the worker says, I have the goods to deliver, so I want to get paid and I want to give you the goods, you do have a right to say I'm not ready to receive the goods because I don't want to pay today. The Aini wrote Salakvo Tachas Haschirus, L'chamoshakasa B'shita Mekubetzis B'Bava Metzia Daf Kufyud Beis B'Shem Arav Rabbi Yehonasan Ayin Sham, which is a very interesting. It's a little scammy. That's a good way of putting it. It does seem a little bit inappropriate. I suppose you do have a right to tell the person I'm not ready to take delivery yet. I think it depends on the situation. Many times, the shoemaker or the dry cleaner will call you, say your stuff is ready. You're not mechuyev to pick it up exactly on the day, but they do have a policy. I mean, obviously with limits. 30 items left over 30 days are forfeited, right? But just because the guy may want to get paid for the dry cleaning or the shoes doesn't mean you're mechuyev to pick them up on the day when they're ready. You can always come back the next day. So there's a balance here. On the one hand, once you take delivery of serviced goods, you have to pay immediately or within that day. On the other hand, and if that means that you're going to be short cash that you need for something else, even for a mitzvah, you're still mechuyev to pay what you owe. The only other option, says the Bir Halacha, is that you don't have to pick it up that day, or you can tell the guy, please don't bring it over. I'm not ready to take delivery yet. Give me a little bit more time. And then you won't be in violation of Baal Tolen. Okay. So I'm glad that was an interesting halach. I'm glad we had a chance to see that inside. And that is related to what we're learning over here. Okay. That he said even Erev Shabbos, you have to pay him on time. So next, Afal Pishalo Nischaibu Hareza Eino Over. So what was this referring to? He says, V'im asa malacha ad halayla, if he worked into the night, you're only in violation if you wait until morning. Wrote Salomar, Afal Pishalon Yischayvu La'abod Ad Halayla. The reason why there's so much more verbiage here is because what we're adding on is that even though the worker had originally contracted to only work during the day, but if his work day extended into the night, then you still wouldn't have to pay him until morning. If they worked the amount of time that they were obligated to work, which was only until sunset, you would have had the obligation to pay them before sunset. So therefore, you might ask the question, here you have a situation where a good worker works overtime, and this creates a disadvantage for the worker, because normally he'd be obligated to be paid before sunset, and now that he's gone overtime and worked past sunset, I don't have to pay him until the morning. That doesn't seem to be fair. He says, "Va'al zeh kasav demikol makom kevin shekolsam melachtam b'layla u'schiras ena mishalemes el basov lefichach yesh lezman leporam kol halayla." But that's the chiddush, is that even though the guy was being nice and worked overtime, and therefore he worked into the night, but since payment is not due until the completion of labor, I don't have to really pay him until the labor is finished. And once the labor is finished, I have that 12 up to 12-hour window in which to pay him. Okay, let's take a look at some of the likutim down here. Yud Beis ad sof hayom. You only have to pay him at the end of the day. Now, v'im habalabayis ba'Amerika v'hapoel be'eretz Yisrael. What if the employer is in America and the worker is in Eretz Yisrael? Whose time zone do you go according to? Uvasof hayom be'eretz Yisrael adayin emtza hayom be'Amerika v'chein lahefech. And at the end of the day in Eretz Yisrael, it's 6 p.m. in Eretz Yisrael, and it's only 11 o'clock in the morning in America. Okay, v'chein lahevich, or vice versa. Bazel lichora basar hapol azlina. You always go according to the time zone of where the worker is. The kevin shaver hayom afal pishal balabayis adayin yom bikomo over bevaltalim. But if the worker is in a later time zone and his day is finished, you will be violating baltalin even if it's 11 o'clock in the morning for you in New York. V'chein lahefech, and vice versa, which I guess that means is that if the employer is in Eretz Yisrael and the worker is in New York, so then you have until the worker has finished his day in which to pay him, in which case it might even be in the middle of the night in Eretz Yisrael, but you don't have to make sure that he's paid until the end of his day. Miu pashat dafka betovo ve'eno ma'akev l'shalem machmas richuk makom zula zeh eno over kidul kaman. He says, but obviously, we're talking about a situation where the worker says payment is due, and there's no impediment in paying him because of the distance spatially. But if there's a preclusion that I can't physically pay you because we're in two different cities, so then we're going to deal with that halach and sif tesvav. Obviously, we're talking about a situation where I have a foreman in Eretz Yisrael who can pay the guy. So the foreman can't make the excuse and say, well, it's only 11 a.m. for the boss, so therefore I don't have to pay you until his time zone of end of day arrives. It doesn't work that way. Okay.
Although, Rabbi, these days, I mean, you could wire the person the money. You know, with technology, you can pay him when he's done, no matter when it is.
Absolutely. A person could be wired the money 100%. But even if a person's working with cash, there are always ways. If you have someone on the ground in Eretz Yisrael to pay him, you can always pay him.
I wonder what would happen if it was in Australia or something like that, where he's finished his work at 4 a.m. your time. Do you have to wake up in order to be able to pay him on time at the end of his day?
You can't give the excuse I'm sleeping when it comes, because if you have a negative commandment, right? Just because you're sleeping doesn't give you an excuse for being over bal tolim.
Mhm.
Yeah, right? Okay. Uschirus eno mishtalemes ela basof. That payment is due at the end of the work. Yesh mi shekasav shim nosea b'monit yedakdek l'shalem rak k'shegomar hanesiya shaz chalachiyuv shel b'yom titein scharo. He says some say that when you're in a cab, you should only pay the driver at the end of the trip because that's halachically the accurate thing. Amnam niradim hamos kayomim b'gemar hanesiya af shuhu nasnam kodem. Let's see, kodem. He says, however, it would seem to me that even if as long as the money is present at the end of the trip, you fulfilled your obligation, even if you want to pay him early. In other words, as long as you don't pay him so far in advance that the money is missing by the time the trip is over. In other words, I think the point that he's making is that there's an imperative to pay him at the end of the job. You don't know when Uber's paying the driver. That's a good question. All right, we'll have to hold it here for today.